We are getting into ethical egoism, so understanding bits of ethical egoism by way of McKinnon and Fiala. So I have you looking at the chapter Egoism, Altruism, and the Social Contract. And this is from a textbook titled Ethics, Theory, and Contemporary Issues. So the McKinnon and Fiala chapter opens with an analysis of altruism and egoism and connecting that to the social contract, whereby we're understanding that altruism basically has to do with a concern for others, which often translates to ethical behavior in general. So in other words, the way in which we understand like a way to be ultimately good is really a way that we're understanding what altruism is to begin with, interestingly enough, right? Yet at the same time, we often need to take into account the egoist in the ways in which we understand the egoist ethically and descriptively, given that we often think that the base of all our actions are rooted in a type of egoism. So recognize that we must recognize first that we must simply observe and describe the behavior that is egoist, and also simply describe the egoist. Okay, so in other words, we have that his or her behavior is self-interested or selfish, right? So this is a descriptive account, okay? So descriptive is not, as it is often mistaken, a prescription. So in other words, it is not normative, okay? So in other words, we have descriptive ethics and we have normative ethics. So this is one of the things that I was noticing students were getting confused with. So descriptive ethics isn't just a description of ethical egoism, that there are other types of descriptive ethics. But in this case, we're making a distinction between descriptive ethics and prescriptive ethics, and we're tying that into egoism, okay? So in other words, descriptive ethics just basically has to do with how it is that we're describing what egoism is, okay? So in other words, descriptive egoism is synonymous with psychological egoism. So the difference is in the idea that psychological egoism is a description, whereby ethical egoism is a prescription and not just a description. So in other words, let's repeat this. Descriptive ethics doesn't just have to do with egoism, but yet when we think of egoism in terms of just simply identifying and describing it, that is what we're terming descriptive egoism, okay? And then normative egoism is the type of egoism that has to do with how we ethically should be, okay? So simply because we describe someone as an egoist, or we look at the data on egoistic tendencies, does not automatically imply a normative action or theory. In other words, just because we observe selfishness does not mean we should be selfish. We often think that just because we could describe an ethical situation, that ethical situation has that normative component tied in it, okay? So, in other words, description is not the same as what we're understanding prescription to be, which is the same as what is normative. So what is normative is prescriptive. What is descriptive has to do with just understanding the facts, data, etc. So McKinnon and Fiala highlight Ayn Rand, who was a capitalist. So she wrote the Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. Some of you may recognize who she is. So she's termed an objectivist. So she was an objectivist philosopher working in the 20th century. So Ayn Rand was a promoter of egoism, and specifically ethical egoism, which also had a faction in what we're thinking of as libertarianism as well. So, or even neo-libertarianism, as with the politicians like Rand Paul, and Paul Ryan. So, in other words, libertarianism perhaps has to do with less regulation, less government regulation on the idea of controlling what it is that companies do. So a libertarian is interested in how it is that we're looking at what we would call laissez-faire capitalism, and how it is that we could have limited government intervention on how it is that we do business, and likewise also how we do politics as well. So the libertarian ideology is political and it's philosophical, with its roots going back to such thinkers as John Locke. And then also there's classical liberalism with J.S. Mill as well in the 19th century. So John Locke, I think, was 17th century, etc. So libertarianism also has its part ideologically in terms of folks who refuse to wear masks, now even during the pandemic, right? Thinking in terms of personal liberties, etc. So going back to Ayn Rand, who believed that helping others and being more altruistic is likened to a type of death wish. So in other words, there's a tie-in with ethical egoism and libertarianism there as well. So the question is, such a behavior, i.e. altruism, pro-social, or should we work against such egoistic tendencies of the ethical egoists to overlook or not care for the concern of others, or should there be more self-sacrifice, right? So the issue of ethical egoism and altruism has a strong connection to how we're understanding libertarianism in connection to Ayn Rand and libertarian politics, etc., right? Neo-libertarian politics, etc. So McKinnon and Fiala also remind us of the ancient Greek word akrasia. So akrasia is understood as weakness of the will. So how does weakness of the will play in the fundamental problems of ethical egoism? So really, this basically translates to the notion that if an individual egoist feels it's in the best interest to follow their own self-interest, weakness of the will is not always taken into account, right? So in the way that the weakness of the will becomes a challenge for the egoist, right? So even if our will becomes weak, we are acting in our own self-interest when So let's see, our will becomes weak even when we are acting in our own self-interest. So if we overeat or we indulge or we say the wrong thing, such weakness will not always undermine our control. So, such weakness is not always in our control. So our bodies show its limits, right? So in our will. So by way of our physical limitations, not to mention even the painful influence of other people, etc., right? So this also ties into the law of unintended consequences as well. So not only with egoism, but also with capitalism. So whenever we set out to do something based solely on self-interest, we also might will and have to face consequences that do not align with another's self-interest. In other words, we set out to do something that we want to do, but yet we don't always account for the law of unintended consequences not going our way, etc. And so this raises a fundamental contradiction for the egoist that is not easily overcome. So, quote, if I wish to have whatever I want, the next guy wishes to have whatever he wants, and there's a probable contradiction there as well in terms of the law of unintended consequences. So we must find that these interests overlap and infringe on one another's wants and desires. So we do not always get what we want, basically, right? So likewise, what we want extends into areas that run counter to our own self-interest to begin with, right? So as we find with the so-called paradox of hedonism, whereby even the egoist aims for self-gratifying pleasure, that pleasure becomes, even as the egoist aims for self-gratifying pleasure, that pleasure becomes elusive and painful. Just because someone always seeks gratification of pleasure does not automatically mean that he or she will find it, right? So pleasure is elusive for the person who becomes enslaved to it, right? So then we move on to the social contract, as it is within the context of the British philosopher Thomas Hobbes and the the founder of modern political philosophy. So Hobbes was born in 1588 and died in 1679. So he's firmly in the 17th century. So he, in his book, The Leviathan, as McKinnon and Fiala write, the idea of the social contract is that it is rational for the self-interested individual. It is rational for self-interested individuals to join together to submit to the rule of law in order to ensure that that promises are kept and that social cooperation will occur, as McKinnon and Fiala write, unquote, right? So Hobbes posited that in our state of nature, what's natural for us before we enter into a social contract of rules and governance is that we're all psychological egoists, okay? So in other words, we're all somehow ethical egoists for Hobbes, and that's why we need the social contract. So in other words, we're each solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, according to Hobbes. And within the rationale of the social contract, we as self-interested individuals enter into an agreement to sacrifice parts and aspects of our own self-interest. So herein, we walk into this network of a community that is working with a set of rules, laws, and guidelines, aka reasonable standards of safety, protection, public and private good, etc., that segues back into such thinkers as John Locke, who was older than Hobbes, and Locke was a powerful influence on the Declaration of Independence, indeed a type of social contract, and so he overlaps into natural law theory, etc., and also libertarianism. And so I think that takes us to the end of what we're going to look at for ethical egoism. So why don't we take it from there, and I'll talk to you soon. Thanks, class.